I am Kari Hagenow. I am with the Door County Invasive Species team. I'm the coordinator for that group, and what that is it's a partnership of natural resources professionals, concerned citizens within Door County, all kind of working together to address some of these invasive species issues like frag-MITE-eez within the county. So we do both education and some control of frag-MITE-eez and other species. Along with me today, I'll just mention, is Krista Lutzke, who's flipping slides for me, and she is a conservationist with the Door County Soil and Water Conservation Department. So she's my right-hand woman when it comes to this kind of stuff. When it comes to identifying frag-MITE-eez from other plants that you may see, and I'll start here, but what I'm going to talk about more than just the identification is what we've already done in Door County, what we're looking to continue to do or do in the future, and then what you can do. So what you can do to control frag-MITE-eez if you have it on your own property, and how you might decide how to control it. So just starting on the identification, what we see in the pictures is Phragmites Australis, Phragmites for short. It's also called common reed, so you may hear it referred to as that. First of all, when you look at a patch like this, we can distinguish this from other grasses because it is so tall and robust and growing in a monoculture, so a really dense stand. We don't typically see any other grasses that will grow this tall in height in Door County. And these stands can be more than 10 feet tall. So we see here that's a stand that's anywhere from 14 to 15 feet in height. So very robust. During the growing season, you'll see these green stems emerging. They're a blue-green in color, which you can see from a distance. They also, I was mentioning to someone just a second ago that if you were to take one of the leaves off of the stem and just peel it back from the stem of the Phragmites plant, what you'll see right where the leaf met the stem are prominent white hairs. And that really distinguishes Phragmites from a lot of the other species that can look similar when it's growing very short or intermixed with the other vegetation. For example, reed canary grass, if you peel the leaf away and look at that, it's got a really long fleshy membrane. It is not hairs and it's not white, it's almost transparent. So that's one way to tell it if you're really doubting yourself, but it looks like it, but it's not 10 feet tall. One other way is, as the growing season goes on, these will form seed heads, but a lot of the time and through the winter, these dead standing stems from the previous year will still be prominent on the landscape. So you'll be able to see last year's seed heads and the dead canes from the previous year. If we go to the next slide, another way that you can identify this species from some of our other species is it gets these really long stolons, or we call them runners. And what it does is it sends these out from the base of the plant. So here we have an established patch of Phragmites with a runner coming out across the shore. Those can be 40 to 50 to 60 feet long each year that those runners grow out. And what happens is every 10 centimeters, a new plant will grow, and that runner will actually root into the ground, and that is the main way that Phragmites will spread. And then it also spreads by seed. So we see in the diagram up here, you get seed dispersal or the spread via rhizomes. So here's an example of a runner, and then these underground roots or rhizomes growing also underneath where we can see them. So what have we done? Really, Phragmites efforts in the county started in 2009. Phragmites is what's called a cryptic invasion. So it's been here, and I say here meaning the Bay of Green Bay and some of these areas, for more than 20 years. And actually by this point it's about 25 years. And it was a part of the system that wasn't very noticeable. And then as the water levels in Lake Michigan started to go down, it exposed a lot of habitat for this species, and it exploded in places like Door County. In Green Bay, it was pretty well established by that point, but we saw a lot of places in Door County that either didn't have it or only had a small patch that became much more widespread in a short period of time. So in 2009, the first little bits were treated. There was an acre treated in 2009 and 10 acres treated in 2010, and that was really Washington Island that got that treatment. But then what happened in 2011 and for 3 years after that is the Wisconsin DNR received funding through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. So you may hear a lot about that in the news today because it was something that was looking to be cut from the budget, and it provides for not only projects like this but water quality and habitat projects throughout the Great Lakes. So really important funding. And the DNR applied for a grant and they received it to treat these conservation opportunity areas. So what those are, you can see them kind of circled in green. Those are areas in Door County that the DNR, through a planning process, identified as the most important habitat type of pieces in Door County. And so those conservation opportunity areas received 3 years of treatment for Phragmites, anything that was found there. And it was pretty successful. If we go to the next slide, you can see where they treated in 2011. So Washington Island, some spotty parts in the Bailey's Harbor area down into Southern Door. If we go to the next slide. So what happened there is they treated that in 2011, but then they retreated it in subsequent years. And if you notice, though, there's a lot of spots in Door County that weren't within a conservation opportunity area. And some of those spots were some of the worst in the county. So we were treating it in certain areas, but not in others. So that was 2012 was when we kind of realized there was a gap in this, and we wanted to do more, and people were asking us to do more. So we began a larger project that worked outside of these conservation opportunity areas and really engaged staff and partners and volunteers and a lot more people than just those DNR treatments did. So what we really started with that first year in 2012, and this might be on the next slide if we move to that. We started with a GPS inventory, so this was sending volunteers out on the shorelines of Southern Door County, within the right-of-ways of Southern Door County, and mapping out these green splotches that are kind of hard to see on this map, but all of those represent a Phragmites patch. So if we go to the next slide, we get a little better idea of what that looks like. We had a volunteer out on the shoreline, and they identified Phragmites as that linear patch along the shore. So then we use that and we get an acreage estimate, how much acreage of Phragmites is there, and then we can bid that out to a contractor to get a price quote for how much that would cost to treat. For this scale, we don't have the staff to do these projects ourselves, so usually what we're doing is bidding them out. So if we go to the next slide, in this case, we had funding present from the U.S. Forest Service, some DNR money that was for education to go with it, but really what spurred it is this U.S. Forest Service funding, and then we asked for donations to the folks that were getting treated, and that matched that funding. So typically when you get a federal or a state grant, you need a matching fund to go 50-50 or 75-25 with that. So we started in Southern Door and Sevastopol that first year, 2012. We treated 32 acres of shoreline and then 16 acres of right-of-way within Door County. And so this is what that 2012 control looked like. And then the plan from there was the next year in 2013, we were going to retreat these areas, but then continue to treat another area. So if we go to the next slide, we can see in 2013, we retreated all of that in Southern Door, but then there were some additional areas that we did a first treatment in. And what happened is, now this is looking at over all the years and all of the Phragmites we mapped. So all of the green on this map, and it's a tough scale to look at this at, but all of the green represents Phragmites that we inventoried. And over the course of that 2012 to 2016, we started in Southern Door, they got 2 years, Sevastopol got 2 years, Egg Harbor, Bailey's Harbor, and just worked our way up the peninsula so that all of the shoreline landowners that we identified Phragmites on their property should have gotten 2 years of treatment if they gave us permission to do that treatment. So we did the 2 years, that finished up, as I said, last year. And something, if we go to the next slide, something that came out of this as we were wrapping up, and really why we were wrapping up is we didn't have the funding to continue this. So we had asked the Forest Service and other funding sources multiple times to continue the project. And at some point they say, well, we've given you money to do all of this, you're done, right? And we know for Phragmites that we're never really done, and it takes multiple years to control this. So 2 years really set it back, but it wasn't enough to finish the job. And it wasn't enough to take care of new patches that had arisen since we did the first treatment. So two things that kind of happened while we were doing all of that work and kind of gearing up knowing we didn't have the funding to continue was the town of Nasswappi passed a noxious weed ordinance that highlighted frag-MITE-eez, followed by the town of Jacksonport passing that ordinance. And knowing knowing that we couldn't continue to pay for that, Jacksonport was one of the worst places in the county. Their shoreline was heavily riddled with this. You can see all of those properties had large amounts of Phragmites on their shoreline. The concerned citizens of the Shores of Jacksonport Association stepped up and said, we don't know how to start a project like this, but we want to pay for it. And so what we did is we trained the Shores of Jacksonport volunteers to go out and do that inventory like I showed you. They mapped it all. They provided that data to me. I made official maps for the contractor with the acreage, and they received a bid for the work and were able to give the maps to that contractor to do the treatment. And they paid for that. They did ask the town, they said, if we're gonna go through the process of asking for permission, doing the treatment, can you agree that if someone doesn't give permission, you will enforce the ordinance and treat it? And the town said yes. The great thing was everybody wanted it treated and the town didn't have to enforce the ordinance. Since then, the Shores of Jacksonport Association has done that treatment for 2 more years, them doing most of the legwork to make that happen. Of course, the patches get smaller and smaller every year, so the cost is less and less for them. When they send out a permission letter, they ask their membership for a $20 donation. And they've been able to sustain that through the donations, although the town has said if there's ever a lapse where the donations don't meet the cost of what it would cost to have that done, the town would make up that difference. So it's just kind of a really successful model for how citizens on the ground kind of took over this effort. And again, every year for them, it's been less and less to treat. And this is one of the worst areas that we did have. So if we go to the next slide. So knowing that not all of us have a really strong neighborhood association or group like that we can rely on, we also try to educate and teach a little bit about what you can do to control it on your own property and what some of the options are. So, Phragmites management is not a one-size-fits-all strategy. You really have to look at what you have on your property and decide what's best based on the time you have available, what you are able to do, and things like that. So 3 things I'm going to talk about here are based on your habitat type, the density, so how thick the Phragmites is on your shoreline or on your property, and the size of the patch. And I always like to point out that the easiest way to control Phragmites is when you first see it. So knowing how to identify it is really, really important. But if you already have it on your property, sometimes we've missed that step. So, we're going to try and give some tips for multiple scenarios of what it might look like on your shoreline or your property. So here's a good example of some of those factors that I was talking about. So this is Phragmites up here, and this is an area that had been treated at one time and it was starting to grow back. So we see that the treatment has stunted it. It's not nearly as tall as what I was talking about. In this case, it was about 2 feet tall. It was early in the season, but still it probably wouldn't look like this in that season to grow that tall. So this is a smaller patch, pretty scattered along the shoreline. Again, not like this, what you see on the bottom, a wall of Phragmites. And not something either that you would likely just spray with herbicide, right? There's some other stuff growing in here that's most likely some good vegetation. We don't want to kill everything on the shoreline, only the Phragmites. So we would use a different method for controlling this up here than we would down here. This is a stand that's solid Phragmites along the shoreline and very, very dense, hard to maneuver in, things like that. So going on from there, one other thing that we want to look at is the habitat type. And this is really important because if it's in water or if it's in a wetland, and the wetland is essentially defined as if I'm standing here in my socks on the day I'm going to treat Phragmites, are my socks getting wet? That's what's going to define if you're in a wetland or not. So if you are in a wetland or the Phragmites is growing in the water, that's when you need a permit from the DNR to do that treatment, and you also need to be a certified applicator. So that can really be a struggle for a single landowner or individual landowner who would like to treat it but doesn't have those things. So the permit itself, we offer to write permits for smaller patches, individual properties. We do not pay the permit fee, but it's pretty small for an individual landowner. Most of them are $25. They fit within the acreage. So it's a $25 cost. The permits are easy for us to write. We would do that. Being an aquatic approved applicator, that involves taking a test to get that certification, and that's a $52 cost for the testing materials, and then the test is free. So a landowner could do that if they choose to, but you do have to study for it, so there is a big time commitment. So we encourage sometimes, if there is a landowner association or a group of landowners, if one person is already certified in some other application, so for example, you would need the certification in aquatic and mosquito. If someone has cropland and is certified there, those tests are very similar. They may be a good person to say, hey, I could get certified in aquatic and mosquito and help my neighbors. Other ways, we do have a list of aquatic approved contractors that you could work with for a cost, obviously, and they'll write the permit and all of that for you as well for that cost. So it is a little more difficult when it's in the water. If it's high and dry, so again, even if it's a seasonal wetland, so if you're in the wetland in spring and there's water all over, but then it dries up, again, to the point where you could stand there in your socks, then you're fine. It really comes down to the day you're going to treat it, what that's like. So, a few things on using herbicides. So I hate to say this because I use herbicides as little as I need to control something. When it comes to Phragmites, herbicides are our best and almost only option. So this picture is a good example of what's underground underneath that patch. More than 50% of the biomass, they say, is usually underground. So what you see above ground, there's equal amounts of plant material below ground. And they're in the form of these really thick and robust rhizomes. We heard a really interesting story today about the rhizomes. When they tore up Highway 41 to redo that project down through Green Bay and the Fox Cities, the Phragmites had actually woven a mat underneath the highway. And those were not separate patches on either side of the highway. It was all connected by a woven mat of these rhizomes far under that concrete. So it's tough stuff, and unless you kill this, you won't get rid of the plant, unfortunately. So we use herbicides as the primary control method also because this was dug out as an example to show the rhizomes or the roots of the plant. But if you were to try and dig this out and you were breaking it into pieces and you weren't able to pick up or remove all of the pieces, this is how it spreads. So breaking that up, each of those can form a new colony. So again, the disturbance can sometimes make it worse. So we go with herbicides as our primary control method. We use broad spectrum herbicides. Unfortunately, there are no ones that are grass specific that you can use in these wet areas. So broad spectrum means it will kill anything. Glyphosate, you see here, that's the active ingredient in Roundup, so it's very similar to Roundup. They make aquatic formulations of glyphosate. Some go by the trade name Rodeo or Aquanite. So those are the same as Roundup, but formulated to use in aquatic habitats. And again, that'll kill everything, right? So we want to be really careful in applying that. If we go to the next slide. So I'm going to just show you some pictures of 3 different methods that we typically use to control Phragmites. And this table kind of tells you when it's good to use that. So hand swiping, scattered or isolated. We use a bundle and cut method when it's a moderate or moderately dense stand, and a foliar spray when it's a really dense stand, so like a wall of Phragmites. I'll talk about the techniques of it and some of the precautions as we go through the pictures here. So the first method is that moderate to moderately dense one, and that's the bundle cut and treat method. So what we do is we pull the stems together in a bundle, and we'll use biodegradable twine to tie that bundle. And then what we'll do is lop it off like you see here, a little bit above that bundle. And then as you see in this picture, we're just dabbing herbicide right onto those cut stems. So we like this method for areas like this. It's dense enough to bundle. That's if you only have a couple stems, you're going to take more time bundling than you could to just treat it with a different method. But here it's dense enough to bundle, but we're doing a method that's not impacting any of the native vegetation under it. So it's a really direct application method. There's no worry about drift or overspray, and it's highly effective in areas like this. Like I said, if you don't have enough stems to do a bundle, or say there's, like this example, the stems are not very tall and they're intermixed with other native vegetation, you couldn't really do a bundle here because you'd be bundling good stuff with the bad stuff. So what we do in those instances is what we call the glove of death, or hand swiping. And we do like this, where you have a chemical resistant glove that comes up fairly high on your arm. We'll take a cheap cotton glove and put it over that. And then they use just little drip bottles. We typically just use a hand sprayer, and we spray that cotton glove with the herbicide. And then we take the plant in our hand, like you see here, and you just wick that herbicide right up the stem of the plant. So that works really well when you only have a handful of stems. Again, here it's intermixed with some really good native vegetation that we don't want to be spraying with glyphosate, because we don't want to see that vegetation die. We want it to be there to provide some resilience against Phragmites or other invasive plant invasion. So really direct application method, and fairly quick if you have a small area. The last method, and this is the one that we usually recommend the least, because there's the highest risk for overspray or drift of the herbicide, but that is a foliar spray. So what that means is spraying the actual leaves of the plant. And we'll typically do that with a pump hand sprayer like you see on the far there, or a backpack sprayer like we see here. And that is literally just a mist or a spray over the plants. You want to cover about 50% of the leaf area with the herbicide. And it's good for when you have a dense wall of Phragmites. Bundling and cutting this would take you a really, really long time to get through, and it can be very difficult maneuvering through these areas and such. So we use a foliar spray in those instances, but we also, if you're doing the foliar spray route, it means you probably have a large patch, and again, it's really dense, so that's where we usually recommend the contractors who have the certifications and are a little more knowledgeable in using that method and avoiding impacts to native plants. As I mentioned, most of the biomass of this plant, you can't see it's below the ground, so we want to make sure that we're affecting that and not just top killing those stems. So we usually treat the plant here, flowering and seed set, August, September, maybe early October. And why we do that is you see this food to rhizomes. So the plant in that time of the year is bringing sugars and bringing energy down into the roots of the plant. And so we want it to also take the herbicide and translocate the herbicide to the root. So that's why we spray it at that time of year. Not to say that you wouldn't be effective with a July treatment, although you're going to be more effective later in the year. So September is again the time we shoot for. If the leaves had started to senesce, meaning if the leaves have started to turn yellow, you're losing your window to do it. Once they're more than 50% yellowed, you're beyond the window. You're wasting time and herbicide and money. So you want to watch that also. Just a few tips too if you're doing an herbicide application. Like I mentioned, you want to just apply to 50%, to have 50% of the vegetation have the herbicide on it, but you also just want to apply to wet, meaning you don't need to have the herbicide dripping off the leaves or dripping down the stem of the plant. You don't need more than that fine mist on there, otherwise you're pretty much just wasting herbicide and increasing the chance that that could impact other vegetation. You want to avoid overspray or drift, so again, you want to be careful of the wind conditions or weather conditions. You don't want to be spraying when it's 15-mile-per-hour winds, because the chances of impacting other vegetation are very high in that instance. It also decreases success if you're not hitting the target vegetation, meaning if it's not hitting the Phragmites and it's going beyond your patch. When you're using herbicides, you always want to follow the label directions. So the label is the law. Everything you need to know about that herbicide and where you're you can use it and how to use it is on the label. It's going to tell you what to wear, how to keep yourself safe. You know, people use Roundup often and never look at the label, and it's actually the law that you have to read it. So that's really important. We also use something called a surfactant in there. If you buy something that's premixed, sometimes surfactants are in there. What those do is they help the plant take in the herbicide. So we use a surfactant called Liberate. And surfactants will help it stick to the plant or help the plant uptake that herbicide. We also use dyes, and that can be as simple as a food coloring, and that helps see where we've sprayed. So if we're doing a foliar spray on plants and we're spraying that patch and we're thinking 50%, a dye will really help you see if you're reaching that 50% or more goal. And then just a couple things about mechanical treatments. We get a lot of questions about cutting or mowing. And I think I touch on it on the next slide. Unfortunately, there's no proof that cutting alone will get rid of this plant. It may set it back. You may see reduced growth in it if you're cutting on a very regular schedule. But you know, I've heard people who have been cutting for a decade and they're doing it on a continuous schedule and they're still doing it because it's still coming back. So there's really nothing to show that that can be effective at completely getting rid of it, although you can use it to manage it if you choose to. The law, so the DNR does allow that you can cut all Phragmites below the ordinary high water mark from your shoreline. And that's of note because usually native plant removal is limited to that 30-foot swath. So Phragmites, there's an exception for. You can cut that with a non-vehicle means anywhere along the shoreline. And then cutting itself, we do use as a tool in conjunction with herbicide for a number of reasons. So when we've done an herbicide treatment and that plant has died and now it's November, December, we would go through and cut all of these dead stems down, and that's going to help us see the next year, the regrowth. So if it starts to come back, we'll be able to see the new stems. In really dense patches, it helps us access those stems, so we're not contending with all of this biomass and trying to work our way through it to find the new stems. And it also, you know, it promotes new plant growth, which sounds counterintuitive, right, to what we're trying to do. But this is going to promote new shoots coming up, and it's going to, you're going to see that spurt of growth. You can treat that the next year, and the plant is, it's its last ditch effort, right, to send energy up and continue growth, and you're hitting it year after year. So there's a number of reasons why we cut these, but we usually only cut it in conjunction with an herbicide treatment for the effectiveness. And then appropriate disposal. So when we're cutting large areas, unfortunately, it's really hard to get rid of all these seed heads. But I will say if we're doing a bundle and cut method, we are bagging up seed heads and taking them off the property with us and disposing of them in the garbage. If we're doing a smaller cutting, we'll still do the same thing. Again, it's really hard in some of these extremely large areas to pick up every seed head. But if you have a small patch and you're able to do it, it's a good practice so that those seeds aren't spreading. And I think I mentioned already that cutting of plants alone is rather ineffective. If you are going to do cutting, you want to do it multiple times throughout the season or late summer or fall when the plant needs the most energy because it's trying to produce those seeds. Mowing alone leaves behind those rhizomes underground. So if you are going to mow or you are going to cut, clean your equipment after too. So not only do the rhizomes break off and spread the plant, parts of the stem could also resprout and spread the plant, and then there's always the seeds. So if you're mowing an area like this, and then you're going to somewhere where Phragmites is not, and you're not cleaning that equipment in between, it can be making the problem worse. And that's all that I have. So feel free to ask questions, and we'll try to answer them.
When you're spraying, are you killing the seed also, or just the green plant?
No, we're killing the green plant. The seeds, I should say, if we're spraying it earlier and the seeds have not matured yet, we may be catching it before the seeds have matured, but in most cases, the seeds are there when we're spraying it. So if the seeds are there and mature, they're not being killed. Phragmites, for a long time, the research was showing that it wasn't viable by seed, meaning it produced seeds, but they weren't able to grow into a new plant. And now the research is showing that a small percentage of those seeds is viable. Well, a small percentage on a plant that produces thousands of seeds is quite a bit, right? Especially when you have a large patch. So we're not killing the seed, and we know that that's still a source for new plants. So that's why we do try to bag it when we can.
A lot of people are concerned you're taking these plants and seeds off the property now, package them up and sending them off to someplace else.
Yeah.
I know we're talking controlled landfills and that, but you're still transferring this weed, and it's possibility of getting away. Wouldn't it be better to burn it right on the property?
So yeah, and the DNR recommends the landfilling option as the best option, and burning is an option, but I give a big caveat with burning. First of all, you have to follow all local ordinances, regulations when you're doing that burning. But the other thing about this plant is those dead stems and the biomass there is incredibly flammable. So I use the example, they did a controlled burn, meaning a burn they planned, they had everything in place to do it down at Point Au Sable, so down along the bayshore of Green Bay. And what they were doing was burning the dead standing stems. So when we say cutting to see the new stems, they decided to try to burn it. That fire was 1900 degrees, and you could see the smoke from Sturgeon Bay when I was leaving work. So it was far more out of control than they thought it would be. It burns incredibly hot. And so a landowner could choose to burn, but they want to be really careful. I mean, you don't want a pile of this and just throw a match into it, because it could get out of hand.
So for the last 2 seasons, I've had just the canes washing up on my beach. So do those canes, and highly flammable,
Yeah.
absolutely. Do the canes include the seeds yet? They've washed up on the beach?
So most of what we're seeing on the beach are pieces of stems that have broken off from wave and ice action and things like that. We occasionally see rhizome pieces come up on the beach. Usually the seeds aren't attached to those, but you know, we talk about a little piece being potentially viable, so a piece of the root starting a new plant. So we see that a lot with the canes washing up, and what we're recommending to people is it's possible that those are dead and can't grow, but we're not sure about that. So we tell them if they can pile it up where it's dry off the shoreline itself, where it might be in the sand and just stay a little moist. If you can dry it out completely, it's going to be dead and it's not going to resprout. In some cases, people are bagging that too and removing it from the shoreline, but some shorelines that we've seen just have too much of this debris to bag it all and get it off. So we recommend that they get it high and dry and really let it dry out to make sure that it's not going to resprout.
Well, and that brings up the fire issue. I think, and Linda's here, I think it would be wise to put in a future newsletter something about the potential of fire. We obviously, with almost 10 inches of rain in the month of June and continuing in July, that is probably not an issue this year. But last year, we just had a tiny little fire with toasting marshmallows, and I could not believe how it started to edge out. And luckily, we had the hose and everything there. But I could see a potential of a raging fire just going all the way down the shore.
Yeah, well, and if you have a newsletter and you want, you know, we'd be happy to write something up for that, because we really don't want to see, you know, wildfires happening because people are burning Phragmites after they've treated it. So yeah, yeah, and we'd be happy to help with that. So, you know, I say it is an option, but you want somebody who's going to sit by that fire and put in individual pieces, not be lighting a stack of it up. So.
First of all, thanks for your presentation.
Yeah.
I try to learn something every day. You took care of all of July.
Oh, good.
I have a number of questions.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's not burdensome. First of all, do we know where it came from to begin with?
This came from Asia. It is now the most widespread plant on the planet. In its native habitat, it doesn't do this, what we see here. And we actually have a native strain of it from the US that we find in Door County that doesn't look like what we see here from the exotic strain either. They think there were a few different means of it coming to our neck of the world, and some of those that I've heard are ballast water, so pieces of this were in the water, as many of our aquatic invasive species get here by that means. But, you know, unfortunately, we also planted this in erosion control mixes. As you can imagine, that mat of rhizomes is really great at holding the soil in, and so it was planted on some roadsides as erosion control at one time. Hasn't been done in many years, but I think we're still obviously living with the impacts of that.
I mean, I recently learned my poison ivy was actually planted as a ornamental plant in this country.
That's how a lot of invasive species get here. And there are other grasses that we don't have here, but that are on our radar that are the same thing. Those were planted ornamentally because they look really pretty in the yard. And
tell me about the water tolerance of this plant. A little bit of background, I live on Sturgeon Bay at Bayshore Drive. And when we moved in the property 4 years ago, we had about 4 feet of beach.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we had maintained it many years. And we had a lot of fragmite, at least I thought it was a lot. I think you would think it's probably not that. But now that all that, and so for several years, I just kept mowing it down at water, collecting all the weeds as much as I possibly could, threw them on my sure we have about a 6-foot wall in front of the property. And I just kept mowing it down. Well, now that's under 6 inches of water, and it's not, seemingly not growing.
Not coming back.
Not coming
That's
back.
good to hear.
Yeah. Pleased about that.
Yeah.
I guess I'm assuming that the rhizomes are still not dead.
Well, it's possible that they could be. So there's a few things that are working at play there, right? So when we started our treatments in 2012, the water level was at its bottom here for us, right? And over the course of 2012 to 2016, a big change happened, that it rebounded very quickly. So what we found over that time is that actually probably helped us because it did drown out some of the newly established. And by drowned out, I mean, we treated it at the right time. So we were still treating it, but it also had the added stress of then being inundated by water. So it wasn't just the water alone, but our treatment combined with the water really helped knock that back, maybe faster than just it staying the same way water level wise and us treating it would have. There's some new research that has come out that we've also been looking at, because what we're seeing in patches, and we do have areas that went untreated. So Detroit Island is an example that we've looked at. That went untreated when the water level was low, and it went untreated through the entire period. So what we're treating in Detroit, off Detroit Island now, is Phragmites that is growing in 6 feet of water, and it's growing out of the water. And so we're getting about this much plant material to treat with another 4, 5, 6 feet of plant material below. So if you do nothing, it can still survive those very high water levels, right? And part of how it does that, and this is some of the research we've been hearing really recently, is that these dead standing stems, they are dead, but they also act as a snorkel, right? For Phragmites to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide and essentially breathe under all that water, even though it has no living stems above the water line. So the rhizomes are still living, they're breathing through the dead stems, and the next year they're sending up new stems. But in the same turn, we have tried now with the water levels back up and a few areas where it's possible to be cutting that, and only cutting as low as we can get, because the other thing we realized is there's a seiche to the lake, right? So if you're cutting this in the morning and you're cutting it below the water level, by midday it can be above the water level. So you have to take that into account too, but we've been trying it, like you said, at some of these spots now where it's in 2 feet of water or 3 feet of water, cutting it and repeatedly cutting it and never letting anything come above the water level. So no living stems, no dead stems. And we're seeing some success in the same way that you are in doing that. But you have to do it repeatedly, and we don't know if it completely kills them. But we do know that after...
If it comes out of the water in my property, it's going to get the weed there.
Yeah, So there's,
Water all over the place, but that's okay.
yeah. So, and we've, like I said, we've got some patches that we're trying that on, and you know, it's been 2 or 3 years now that we haven't seen new growth out of it, but I'm not gonna dig it up either to try to grow one of those roots to see if it's still living,
But
so.
I can keep doing that and not let it grow and use herbicide.
Yeah, if you've been managing it that way and you're not seeing new growth, is it shooting up new stems or has it just been dormant? Yeah. If it's not shooting up new stems, there's really nothing to herbicide. Yeah, and I would just keep doing what you're doing, because in my mind and in theory, right, that should eventually die. It's got no source of gas exchange really. It's not getting any nutrients, you know, not photosynthesizing. So I would keep doing that if it's working and it's not coming back. So.
Then I just bundled up, put it in the burn barrel, and made a nice fire. I'm curious how much the mitigation effort was in Jacksonville. How much it cost? Approximately. 10,000, 100,000.
Oh, not that
No.
much. No.
For the very first year of treatment that the Shores of Jacksonville provided funding for, it was approximately $1,000. And that's because that was after the second year of treatment that the county had provided. And they still had, I believe, like 6 acres maybe along the shorelines, very few and far between, however. So at this point, they're at about 3% of their original population.
Yeah.
So as the,
I asked because I'm involved in the Bay Shore Property Owners Association. I don't know if they've ever done anything.
We've certainly talked to them about it, and there's been some interest. So, yeah, and it can vary. Again, it depends on how much there is, how many landowners. Most townships, thinking of Naswapi too, and what that cost is for doing the whole township. I mean, that was like $3,000. So, and that's for the township. So that's a pretty large area. You know, but depending on what it looks like too, I'll give the example of I work for the Nature Conservancy, so I wear 2 hats when I'm not doing this. We had 25 acres of it treated where it was very, very bad on Raleigh's Bay, and they needed a marsh master, so a very specialized piece of equipment to treat that. That essentially cost us $1,000 per acre. So there can be a wide range of variation, but in the places where we've treated it in the shorelines where it's been knocked back significantly, the cost is greatly reduced. So.
And thank you.
Yeah. Anything else?
Well, I'm curious. I look at this this picture. It's very useful. And I guess I'm gonna walk around my property and see what I got. Is it possible for somebody to walk along with me and say, this is the good stuff?
It totally is, and we can talk after if you're interested in that. So that is something that the Door County Invasive Species Team offers, is one-on-one site visits with landowners who are interested in what they have and what they can do.
Yeah, we bought
to
the
help the
property
effort,
4 years
so.
ago. It's trying to tame it, if you will.
Yeah. So.
I agree, that was an excellent presentation, and I really appreciate that the Door County Invasive Species Team, along with Soil and Water, has stepped forward and trying to keep this plant under control before it is totally out of control, as in Brown County or some of the other counties. And I also would like to, we've had a very healthy response from our town property owners along the shore. We really appreciate that, and they've also included some donations, so that's fantastic. So my question is, you know who the responsive people are. Will you be contacting each and every one of them, going to their property and inventory? And what about, say, a neighbor who has not responded, but you can easily see that there might be a Phragmite out there? Can you be in touch with them, or?
Yeah, well, I'll let you touch in a second, but I will say a lot of the inventory is, we're working with some volunteers to do some of that. So we, actually, I had some of my staff go out and already inventory the rights of way in Sevastopol, so that's been done. But the shoreline, we are working with some volunteers to help us collect that, so we do have it.
So it's going to be very much like what Jacksonport has put into place is going to be mirrored within Sebastopol. So we put the feelers out for a lot of individuals who are interested or willing to do a little more along the shores. And these volunteers are going to be inventorying on a continuing basis, and they'll provide the data to either Kari or myself, and then we map this information. So then, once we get these maps and the parcel numbers of all of the present Phragmites, we can share that with the town as well. We don't specifically seek out the individuals, they call us to do the one-on-one site visits. And that was in the letter, where if you are interested, please give us a call or come to this meeting for more information. What we can do, or what we have done in the past, is if someone is concerned or curious about the treatments, we can give them a phone call and let them know and give them a heads up on when that happens. But for all intents and purposes, this is just something that gets run by a really strong group of volunteers in the support of the town. And it almost goes unnoticed by those who don't have as much fervor to do as much as other people.
I think some of our residents on Glidden Drive, I can
Yes.
think of one or two in particular that have already stepped forward, like you said.
Yeah, and they were at the training.
Yeah, I had at least 2 folks from Glidden Drive at a training.
Because we're getting close to that application season, August, September, and
Mhm.
early October, that'll be upon us before we know it. So
Yeah, absolutely. And
the sooner the better.
yes, yep. And you're going to be coordinating soon with actually these volunteers to provide or to obtain their GPS units that we lent out,
Oh, sure.
because DSIST has GPS units on loan for landowners to do the inventory. And then she'll upload the data, and then I share that with the township. Or my partner Chuck is with Sebastopol. So it's kind of like the trickle down of information.
So. Well, thank you for having us.
That was a great
Thank you.
presentation.
Don't be discouraged